In the world of 1960s high society, there were Truman Capote's Swans, elegant women of immense wealth and impeccable breeding who never had to work for anything. And then there was the woman they despised, Helen Gurley Brown. She wasn't a swan. She was, in her own unforgettable words, a mouseburger, a poor, plain girl from the middle of nowhere who had clawed her way up from the secretarial pool. She was the ultimate outsider, and she was about to start a revolution. This is the story of the woman who took a dying magazine, Cosmopolitan, and turned it into a global hot pink Bible for a new kind of woman, one who wasn't ashamed to want a career, money, and great sex, all without a wedding ring. She wrote the scandalous bestseller Sex and the Single Girl, and in doing so, became a feminist icon to millions and a vulgar traitor to the elite. How did this terrified girl from the Ozark Mountains become one of the most powerful and controversial women of the 20th century? To understand the revolution she started, we must first understand the suffocating world she was rebelling against. The early 1960s in America were a time of simmering, seismic change, a cultural pressure cooker with the lid rattling violently, about to blow. The buttoned-up gray flannel suit conformity of the 1950s was still the dominant force, a national facade of quiet domesticity and prosperous order. But underneath that placid surface, a revolution was brewing. The civil rights movement was marching its way into the nation's conscience, its calls for justice challenging the very foundations of American society. In the coffee houses of Greenwich Village, the folk music of a young Bob Dylan was giving a raw, poetic voice to a new generation's anxieties and its disillusionment with the establishment. And perhaps most profoundly, the first hormonal birth control pill, approved by the FDA for contraceptive use in 1960, was about to quietly and irrevocably sever the ancient, ironclad link between sex and procreation. For women, this tiny pill was a declaration of independence more potent than any political treaty, offering a freedom over their own bodies that was previously unimaginable. This was the volatile, expectant landscape into which Helen Gurley Brown, now a successful advertising copywriter in her late 30s, and newly blissfully married to David Brown, prepared to launch her cultural hand grenade. Urged on, or rather commanded by her husband, she began to write. The process was not that of a seasoned author. She was a copywriter, a pragmatist, a list maker. She approached the book with the same methodical, results-oriented zeal that she applied to a successful advertising campaign. She would spend her days at the ad agency, then come home to their apartment, and after a quick dinner, David would usher her to the typewriter. He was not just her champion. He was her editor, her strategist, and her drill sergeant. He would give her assignments. Tonight, write the chapter on having an affair, or let's tackle the chapter on money. She would write late into the night, pouring all the hard-won, often painful lessons from her years in the secretarial trenches, all her sharp-eyed observations about men, work, and money, onto the page. She wrote not with the elegant prose of a literary novelist, but with the punchy, direct, and often brutally honest voice of a woman sharing secrets with her best friend over a cocktail. She wasn't a sociologist analyzing trends. She was a survivor drawing a map for other survivors. The result was a manuscript with a title that was both a simple statement of fact and a brazen declaration of war against the status quo, Sex and the Single Girl. The book was a direct frontal assault on the deeply entrenched myth that a woman's life was a meaningless prologue until the main story, marriage, began. Helen's message was electrifyingly simple, and for its time, profoundly heretical. Being single is not a waiting room for marriage. It is not a disease to be cured or a problem to be solved. It can be a fabulous, exciting, glamorous, and deeply fulfilling adventure. And she wasn't just talking about emotional fulfillment or the vague satisfaction of a career. She was talking with unprecedented frankness about the taboo trinity of modern female life: money, career, and, most shocking of all, sex. The book was structured not as a narrative, but as a meticulously organized how-to manual for the modern single woman, a playbook for winning the game of life. It was filled with blunt, specific, and often startlingly practical advice on the subject of money, a topic that was considered deeply unladylike for women to discuss. She was a revolutionary. "A job is not a place to find a husband," she wrote. "It's a place to find yourself and a paycheck." She gave detailed advice on budgeting, on saving, on investing, on the supreme importance of having what she called a little private heap of few money. This concept alone was a revelation. In an era when women often couldn't even get a credit card without a husband's signature, the idea of financial independence as a primary goal was radical. Women were supposed to be financially dependent on men. Helen told them to be dependent only on themselves, to see money not as a dirty secret, but as the ultimate tool of freedom. On the subject of career, she was equally uncompromising. She told women to be ambitious, to work hard, to see their jobs not as a way to pass the time before marriage, but as a source of identity and power. And she advised them to use every asset at their disposal to get ahead. This included, most controversially, using their femininity. She famously advised women to be a sex object in the office. Decades later, this phrase would be stripped of all context and used as a club to beat her with by her feminist critics. But what she meant was complex and, in its own way, deeply pragmatic. She was not advising women to be promiscuous or to sleep their way to the top in a transactional sense. She was advising them to be attractive, charming, magnetic, and to understand that in a world run by men, their appeal as women was a form of power that they should not be ashamed to use. "The girl who is a sex object is a girl men will fight to have on their team," she wrote. It was advice born from her own experience, a recognition of the world as it was, not as it should be. She was telling women to play the hand they were dealt, but to play it brilliantly. And then, of course, there was the sex. Helen wrote about sex with a frankness and a joyousness that was simply unheard of. In 1962, mainstream culture spoke of sex only in hushed, clinical, or moralistic tones, almost exclusively within the context of marriage. Helen blew the doors off. She argued that sex was not something a woman gave a man in exchange for commitment, nor was it a sacred duty to be performed for procreation. It was, she declared, a natural, healthy, and intensely pleasurable part of life that single women could and should enjoy, guilt-free. She wrote about how to conduct an affair with a married man, offering practical advice on discretion and emotional self-preservation. She wrote about contraception, about the importance of a woman understanding her own body, and about taking responsibility for her own pleasure. She famously described the single woman's romantic life, not as a desperate search for the one, but as a delightful smorgasbord of experiences, where she could sample a variety of men and relationships before deciding what or who was right for her. In 1962, this was not just controversial. It was moral dynamite. She was systematically dismantling the pillar of female shame that had propped up the entire social structure of dating, courtship, and marriage for centuries. When the manuscript was finished, David Brown, acting as her agent, began shopping it around to the major publishing houses in New York. The reaction was almost universally one of fear and disgust. Publisher after publisher rejected it. The manuscript was passed around editorial offices like a piece of contraband. It was too scandalous, too immoral, too dangerous. One editor famously wrote in his rejection letter that the author must be a deeply troubled and neurotic woman. They simply could not comprehend that a woman, and a happily married one at that, could write so brazenly about such things. But David persisted. He was utterly convinced of the book's potential. Finally, a smaller, more daring publisher, Bernard Geese Associates, known for taking risks on controversial books like Jacqueline Suzanne's Valley of the Dolls, saw the genius in it. They saw not just a scandalous book, but a commercial goldmine. They took a chance. Sex and the Single Girl was published in May 1962, and the reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The book became a runaway word-of-mouth phenomenon. It shot to the top of the bestseller lists and stayed there for over a year. It sold millions of copies in the United States alone and was eventually translated into dozens of languages, becoming an international sensation. For millions of single women across America and around the world, secretaries, teachers, nurses, flight attendants, the book was more than just a bestseller. It was a revelation. It was as if someone had finally opened a window in the stuffy, airless room of their lives and shouted, "You are not alone, and you are not a failure." They felt seen, understood, and profoundly validated. Letters poured into the publisher's office by the thousands, all addressed to Helen, all thanking her for giving them permission to live their own lives, to be ambitious, and to not feel ashamed of their desires or their single status. She wasn't just an author. She had become a guru, a high priestess, a glamorous and worldly big sister who had been through it all and was now sharing all her hard-won secrets. The establishment, however, was absolutely horrified. The book was denounced from church pulpits, condemned in newspaper editorials, and debated with furrowed brow seriousness by sociologists. Critics, overwhelmingly male, called her a purveyor of filth, an enemy of the family, and the high priestess of the cult of the bed. She was accused of promoting promiscuity, of encouraging young women to become calculating courtesans, and of seeking to destroy the moral fabric of the nation. She became a fixture on television talk shows, a perfect target for the gladiatorial combat of early television interviews. She would sit, a small bird-like woman with a soft, almost little girl whispery voice and huge expressive eyes, calmly and politely defending her radical ideas against the blustering, patronizing outrage of male hosts who treated her like a curious and dangerous creature from another planet. They expected her to be a hard-bitten, cynical vamp. Instead, they found a witty, charming, and surprisingly traditional woman who was utterly, unshakably convinced of her own message. One of the most fascinating contradictions of her newfound fame was the one that her critics seized on with glee. Helen Gurley Brown, the great apostle of the single life, was now very happily and very publicly married. They saw this as the ultimate hypocrisy. If being single is so fabulous, they sneered in print and on air, why did you get married? But they were profoundly missing the point of her entire philosophy. Helen's message was never that women shouldn't get married. Her message was about choice and power. It was about making the single years a time of profound self-discovery, financial independence, and personal adventure, so that if and when a woman chose to marry, she would do so from a position of strength, as a whole, confident and experienced person, not as a desperate, terrified girl grabbing the first man who came along as a life raft. Her own happy, supportive, and intellectually vibrant marriage to David was, in her eyes, the ultimate proof that her system worked. She hadn't married to be saved. She had married an equal. The astonishing success of Sex and the Single Girl transformed Helen Gurley Brown from an anonymous, successful copywriter into a national celebrity and a cultural icon. It also drew a permanent line in the sand. You either loved her and what she stood for, or you loathed her. There was no in between. She had given a voice to a previously silent demographic and had become fabulously wealthy and famous in the process. The mouseburger had arrived. But her greatest, most enduring act was yet to come. She had written the Bible for the new single girl. Now she was about to create her church. And its temple would be a failing, forgotten magazine with a once proud name, Cosmopolitan. By the mid-1960s, Helen Gurley Brown was no longer a person. She was a phenomenon. Sex and the Single Girl had been adapted into a frothy, sanitized Hollywood movie starring Natalie Wood and Tony Curtis, and Helen herself was a sought-after, if highly controversial, public figure. She had a syndicated advice column, Woman Alone, that ran in newspapers across the country. She was a regular and always ratings-grabbing guest on talk shows. But she was restless. She knew that the lightning in a bottle success of a single book could fade. She didn't want to be a one-hit wonder, a temporary cultural curiosity. Her husband, David Brown, a man who thought in terms of franchises and empires, knew she needed a bigger, more sustainable platform, a way to keep her message alive, to evolve it, and crucially to monetize it on a grand, continuous scale. The world of American women's magazines at the time was a sleepy, placid, and profoundly predictable landscape. The market was dominated by a group of publications known as the Seven Sisters, including titans like Good Housekeeping, Ladies' Home Journal, and McCall's. These magazines were the sacred texts of the suburban housewife. Their pages were a wholesome, reassuring collage of recipes for pot roast, articles on new household cleaning techniques, tips for raising obedient children, and sentimental fiction about the quiet dramas of married life. They were beautifully produced, highly profitable, and utterly dedicated to reinforcing the feminine mystique. The single, working woman, Helen's passionate, newly awakened audience, was a ghost in their machine. She simply did not exist on their pages, except perhaps as a cautionary tale or a figure of pity. Then an opportunity arose, born from failure. The mighty Hearst Corporation, one of America's great media conglomerates, owned a magazine called Cosmopolitan. In its glory days, decades earlier, it had been a respected and prestigious literary journal, a place where giants like Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Sinclair Lewis had published their stories. But by 1965, Cosmopolitan was a tragic shadow of its former self. It was a dull, directionless, general interest publication hemorrhaging money and readers at an alarming rate. Its circulation had plummeted to below 800,000, a disastrous figure for a major monthly. The magazine was a joke in the industry, a patient on life support, and the executives at Hearst were on the verge of pulling the plug and shutting it down for good. It was David Brown, with his producer's knack for seeing potential where others saw only decay, who had the audacious, almost insane idea. He wrote a now legendary memo to the top executives at Hearst. In it, he argued that they were sitting on a gold mine and didn't know it. There was a huge untapped market of young single working women, and his wife, Helen, was the only person in America who knew how to speak their language. He proposed that they fire the current male editor and give Helen complete control of the dying magazine. The response from the Hearst Tower was, predictably, one of sheer incredulity. Give their failing but once proud flagship to the scandalous author of Sex and the Single Girl, the woman the establishment press loved to vilify, the mouseburger from Arkansas with no formal magazine editing experience. It seemed like a recipe for corporate suicide, a final embarrassing nail in Cosmopolitan's coffin. But Helen was prepared. She had been thinking about this, dreaming about it. She walked into the imposing wood-paneled boardroom of powerful gray-suited male executives, a tiny, determined figure in a smart dress, her whispery voice a strange contrast to the sheer force of her conviction. She delivered the pitch of a lifetime. She didn't talk about demographics or advertising revenue in abstract terms. She told them a story. She told them she knew a girl who was being completely, utterly ignored by every magazine on the newsstand. This girl, she explained, was young, ambitious, and probably lived in a big city. She wanted a fulfilling career, but she also desperately wanted a man. She was interested in love, sex, and money, and she wasn't ashamed of it. She was fun, she was fearless, and she was female. "This is the cosmopolitan girl," Helen declared, her voice gaining strength. "And I know how to talk to her, because I was her. I am her." She laid out her vision with the breathtaking clarity of a military strategist. The new Cosmopolitan would be an indispensable guide for this girl. It would have articles on how to succeed in the office and how to succeed in the bedroom, often on the same page. It would talk frankly about the pill, the female orgasm, and how to deal with a difficult boss. It would feature fashion that was sexy, aspirational, and a little bit daring, not dowdy and practical. And the cover, she insisted, would be the most important part of the revolution. No more wholesome, smiling models in aprons or collegiate sweaters. The Cosmo cover girl would be a bombshell. She would have cleavage, lots of it. She would have tousled, just out of bed hair. And most importantly, she would be staring directly, defiantly, at the reader, a look of bold, confident, sexual invitation in her eyes. The cover itself would be a monthly manifesto. The executives were terrified. It was a gamble of epic proportions. This wasn't just a redesign, it was a complete moral and cultural rebranding. But they were also desperate. The magazine was about to fold anyway. The accountants had already written it off. What did they really have to lose? In a decision that would change the face of popular culture and the magazine industry forever, they said yes. They gave her a shoestring budget, a skeptical, demoralized staff, and a 3-issue trial period to prove herself. Helen Gurley Brown walked out of that boardroom as the new editor-in-chief of Cosmopolitan. In July 1965, her first issue hit the newsstands. The impact was immediate and electric. The cover was everything she had promised. A model in a very low-cut pink dress, her expression a perfect blend of innocence and provocation. Around her, splashed in bold, brash fonts, were the headlines that would become her trademark, a cocktail of self-improvement, sex, and celebrity, the pill, and the new morality. The world's most exciting mistresses. I was a Playboy bunny. It was unlike anything anyone had ever seen on a mainstream women's magazine. It was a shot of adrenaline straight to the heart of a comatose industry. The magazine sold out on newsstands across the country almost instantly. Hearst had to rush to print more copies. Circulation, which had been languishing below 800,000, shot up by hundreds of thousands overnight. Within a few issues, it had crossed the 1 million mark and was still climbing. By the end of the decade, it would be over 1.5 million. Helen Gurley Brown had not just saved Cosmopolitan, she had performed a resurrection. She had created a cultural juggernaut and a money-making machine for Hearst that would generate billions of dollars over the next several decades. She ran the magazine with a fanatical, obsessive, and often maddening zeal. She was a complete micromanager, working punishingly long hours, personally editing every single word, every headline, every photo caption that went into the magazine. Her memos to her staff became legendary in the industry, long, rambling, single-spaced screeds typed on her signature pink paper, filled with a dizzying mix of effusive praise, "You're a genius, pussycat," stinging criticism, and a constant, frantic stream of new ideas for articles. She was a demanding, exhausting boss, but she was also a brilliant and nurturing mentor to a generation of young female writers and editors. She paid them well, far better than most other women's magazines, and she pushed them to be bold and fearless in their work. The content of Cosmo was a unique and often head-spinningly contradictory cocktail. One article would be a serious investigation into workplace discrimination, or a guide to getting a bank loan. The very next would be a frothy, breathless piece titled "How to Turn Your Man into a Raging Sexaholic," or "Living Through His First Heart Attack with Him." It mixed practical financial advice with articles on how to flatter a man's ego. It championed female ambition, while also providing detailed, almost clinical instructions on how to please a man in bed. This very contradiction was the source of its immense appeal, and also the reason it would soon find itself under attack from a new and unexpected quarter. Just as Cosmo was hitting its stride in the late 1960s, the women's liberation movement, or second-wave feminism, was exploding into the national consciousness. Leaders like Betty Friedan, whose 1963 book The Feminine Mystique had diagnosed the problem that has no name among suburban housewives, and Gloria Steinem, the brilliant journalist who would soon co-found the explicitly feminist Ms. Magazine, were arguing for a radical political transformation of society. They were fighting for systemic change, for equal pay, for reproductive rights, for an end to the deep-seated institutional sexism that held women back in every sphere of life. And they looked at Helen Gurley Brown's hot pink Cosmopolitan with absolute horror. To them, Cosmo was not a tool of liberation. It was a giant, glossy step backward. They saw the pouting, cleavage-bearing cover girls, the obsessive articles on makeup and pleasing men, and they saw a magazine that was teaching women to be nothing more than sexual objects, pretty, pleasing playthings for men. They argued that HGB's entire philosophy was shallow, consumerist, and profoundly apolitical. While they were trying to dismantle the patriarchy, Helen was teaching women how to navigate it, how to use their feminine wiles to get what they wanted within the existing corrupt system. In their view, she wasn't a revolutionary, she was a collaborator. The famous feminist writer Kate Millett organized a sit-in at Helen's Park Avenue office in March 1970. For hours, a group of about 100 women occupied the space, holding signs and accusing her of publishing a magazine that was obscene and deeply offensive to women. The ideological battle between Helen Gurley Brown and the leaders of the feminist movement was one of the great cultural clashes of the era. Helen was genuinely, painfully bewildered by their criticism. In her own mind, she was the ultimate feminist. She was pro-woman, pro-ambition, pro-sex, pro-money. She argued with a logic that infuriated her critics that looking sexy and wanting to attract a man did not make a woman a traitor to her gender. "Good feminists can be pretty," she famously retorted. "They can wear lipstick and mascara." She believed that the political feminists were dour, humorless, sexless, and hopelessly out of touch with what ordinary women, the millions of mouseburgers in the secretarial pools, really wanted and worried about. The truth is, in the complex ecosystem of social change, they were both right and they were both necessary. The political feminists were the strategists working to change the laws and the fundamental structures of society. a fight that was essential, arduous, and transformative. Helen, on the other hand, was the field tactician. She was speaking directly to the individual woman, the mouseburger, at her desk on a Tuesday morning, and giving her the tools, the confidence, and the permission to improve her own life right now within the world she actually lived in. HGB's feminism wasn't about changing the system. It was about winning the game. And millions of women, the ones who actually bought magazines, voted with their wallets. While the more intellectual Political Ms. magazine, launched in 1972, often struggled for circulation and advertising, Cosmopolitan became a global phenomenon, launching international editions that spread the gospel of the Cosmo girl around the world. Helen Gurley Brown had created not just a brand, but a philosophy and a global empire. She was the high priestess of a new, commercialized, and wildly popular kind of femininity. She was rich, powerful, and influential beyond her wildest mouseburger dreams. But the one thing she could never quite win, the one prize that remained stubbornly out of her grasp, was the respect of the intellectual and social elite. This public success masked a private world of fascinating, deep-seated contradictions. By the 1970s and into the supercharged, shoulder-padded decade of the 1980s, Helen Gurley Brown was no longer just an editor. She was an institution. The whispery-voiced girl from the Ozark Mountains was now the undisputed queen of a global media empire. Cosmopolitan, her hot pink Bible, was a cultural monolith, a fixture on every newsstand and in every drugstore from London to Tokyo. Its audacious formula of sex, self-improvement, celebrity, and consumerism endlessly replicated and translated for a global audience of eager disciples. She and her husband, David Brown, had become one of the most formidable power couples in America. While she was building her magazine empire, he had gone on to produce some of the biggest and most iconic blockbuster films in Hollywood history, including the Oscar-winning phenomenon The Sting, and the movie that made an entire generation afraid to go into the water, Jaws. They were fantastically wealthy, with a glamorous, art-filled apartment on Central Park West that overlooked the park, a permanent and coveted place on the A-list of every important party and premiere. On the surface, she had achieved everything the terrified girl from Green Forest, Arkansas, had ever dreamed of, and 1,000 things more. But the psychology of the mouseburger never truly left her. Her daily life, even at the zenith of her power, was a study in fascinating, deeply ingrained contradictions. Despite her immense wealth and her 7-figure salary, she was famously, almost pathologically, frugal. This was not the charming eccentricity of the rich. It was a bone-deep, visceral insecurity. She would arrive at her lavish, pink-accented office in the Hearst Tower, an office with a stunning view of Central Park, clutching a brown paper bag. Inside would be her lunch, often consisting of nothing more than a single container of yogurt and perhaps a piece of fruit. While her editors were taking advertisers out for lavish meals at places like La Grenouille, Helen was eating at her desk. She was known to walk miles across Manhattan in her high heels to save on a taxi fare. When she and David traveled, even for glamorous international events, she insisted they fly coach, much to his chagrin. This wasn't just a quirk, it was the lingering ghost of the Great Depression, the deep-seated fear of the poverty that had haunted her childhood. It was as if she believed on some primal level that the money, the success, the entire glittering facade could all vanish in an instant, and she would be right back in that dreary secretarial pool with nothing but her wits to protect her. Her work ethic was legendary, a force of nature that both inspired and terrified her staff. Her day began before dawn with a punishing exercise routine. She would arrive at the office early and be the last to leave, her enormous desk a chaotic flurry of manuscripts, layouts, proofs, and her famous memos. She remained a complete micromanager, obsessed with every detail. She had to approve every cover line, every fashion credit, every turn of phrase. She believed correctly that the cosmopolitan voice was her voice, and she could not bear to have it diluted. She was a demanding and often difficult boss. She could be brutally critical, her soft voice delivering devastating critiques that left editors reeling. Yet, she was also fiercely loyal and incredibly generous to those who earned her trust. She was a mentor to a generation of young female writers and editors, a mother hen to her pussy cats, as she called them. She paid them well, fought for their promotions, and took immense pride in their successes. She was creating an army of Cosmo girls in her own image, hard-working, ambitious, and utterly devoted to the cause. Her obsession with control extended to her own physical appearance. She maintained a rail-thin, almost skeletal figure through a lifelong regimen of extreme dieting and relentless exercise. She weighed herself daily, and a gain of a single pound could send her into a spiral of anxiety. She would famously put her foot up on her desk to show off her still slender legs during interviews well into her 70s, a defiant, almost desperate gesture from a woman who had spent her entire life feeling physically inadequate. She was one of the first major public figures to speak openly and cheerfully about her plastic surgeries, discussing her nose job, eye lift, and silicone injections with the same frankness she applied to orgasms. She saw her body not as something to be accepted, but as a machine that needed to be constantly maintained, upgraded, and improved, a crucial asset in the never-ending battle for success and visibility in a world that she believed was ruthlessly judgmental of women's appearances. Her relationship with David was the undisputed bedrock of her life. It was a true partnership of equals, a collaboration in life and work. They were each other's biggest cheerleaders and sharpest, most trusted critics. Every night she would bring home a briefcase, bulging with manuscripts, and David, after a long day of producing blockbuster movies, would dutifully read the copy, making notes in the margins, suggesting better headlines, sharpening an argument. They were a self-contained, mutually adoring unit, a team of two against the world. Their marriage, which would last for over 50 years until his death, was a testament to a deep and abiding love, intellectual partnership, and mutual respect. It was the quiet, powerful refutation of the idea, so often leveled by her critics, that her philosophy was somehow anti-marriage or anti-love. But even at the height of her power and personal happiness, she could never quite shake the feeling of being an outsider, and the elite of the intellectual and literary world, the very world she secretly longed to join, never let her forget it. This brings us back to Truman Capote and his rarefied world of Swans. The disdain that he and his circle felt for Helen Gurley Brown was palpable, a quiet, condescending chill in the glamorous rooms where their worlds occasionally intersected. To them, she was the epitome of everything they considered vulgar, common, and new money. Why did they despise her so? It wasn't just about her frank message of sex and ambition. It was, at its core, about class. Capote's Swans, women like Babe Paley and Slim Keith, were paragons of effortless, inherited grace. They never had to try. Their style, their taste, their position in society was a birthright, something absorbed with their mother's milk. They were famous for being, not for doing. Their lives were an art form of curated perfection. Helen, on the other hand, had to work for it, and she wasn't ashamed to admit it. In fact, her entire philosophy was based on the virtue of effort. She talked openly, even gleefully, about the things the elite considered unmentionable: the desperate daily struggle for money, the raw hunger for success, the messy mechanics of sex. She was loud, she was commercial, she was unapologetically ambitious. Her entire message of self-improvement was predicated on the idea that one was not perfect to begin with, an idea that was anathema to the world of the Swans, who projected an aura of innate, unassailable perfection. Her staggering commercial success was a mirror held up to their own increasing cultural irrelevance. While they were gliding through their exclusive world of private dinner parties and charity balls, Helen was connecting with millions of real women in a way they never could. She was building a global empire, while their world of inherited privilege and old-world etiquette was slowly beginning to seem like a fragile, fading diorama. They saw her as a barbarian at the gates, a tacky, noisy Araviste who had crashed their exclusive party and was now teaching the masses how to mimic their style, but without any of their subtlety or breeding. The more successful she became, the more they sneered. Helen was acutely, painfully aware of this snobbery, and it wounded her deeply. For all her talk of confidence and fearlessness, for all her millions of adoring readers, she craved the approval of the very people who looked down on her. She wanted to be seen not just as a successful populist magazine editor, but as a serious intellectual, a woman of substance, a thinker. It was a validation she would never truly receive from the literary establishment. To them, she would always be the Cosmo girl, the purveyor of cleavage and breathless headlines about orgasms. They could never forgive her for being so popular, so commercial, and so incredibly successful on her own terms. But while the critics in New York sneered, her influence across the rest of the world only grew. She had an uncanny, almost supernatural ability to tap into the zeitgeist. As the decades changed, so did Cosmo, but its core paradoxical message remained the same. Through the sexual revolution of the 1970s, the greed is good era of the 1980s, and the girl power wave of the 1990s, the magazine continued to speak to its core reader, evolving with her, but never abandoning her. The Cosmo girl was now a global archetype. Helen Gurley Brown hadn't just created a magazine, she had created a new, enduring, and globally recognized model of modern womanhood. She remained at the helm of the American edition of Cosmopolitan for 32 years, an almost unheard of tenure in the volatile world of magazine publishing. She finally and reluctantly stepped down in 1997, but remained on the masthead as the editor-in-chief of Cosmopolitan's vast and lucrative network of international editions. She had outlasted all her critics. The feminist leaders who had once picketed her office had seen many of their own, more politically pure magazines struggle and fold, while Cosmo continued to thrive. The society swans who had scorned her had faded into tragic, bitter obscurity, their names now just footnotes in the history of a bygone era, immortalized only by the cruel pen of their supposed friend, Truman Capote. Helen, the mouseburger from Arkansas, was still standing. She had proven that she was not just a fad or a guilty pleasure or a passing trend. She was a force of nature who had redrawn the map of female desire. Her long and revolutionary career was nearing its end, but the debate over her work and its profound impact on the world was only just beginning. What is the ultimate legacy of a woman as revolutionary and as contradictory as Helen Gurley Brown? Even today, decades after the peak of her influence, in a world saturated with social media influencers and self-help gurus who are in many ways her direct descendants, she remains a figure of fierce debate. Was she a feminist trailblazer who single-handedly empowered a generation of women to seize control of their lives? Or was she a canny, brilliant capitalist who sold them a glittering consumerist fantasy of liberation that was, in reality, just a new and more demanding form of servitude to men and the patriarchy? The truth, as is often the case with figures who truly change the world, is that she was both. And it is in that very contradiction, in that messy, vibrant, and often problematic space, that her true and enduring significance lies. Her tangible impact is impossible to overstate. Before Helen Gurley Brown, the single working woman was a cultural ghost. She was invisible in the mainstream media, a figure of pity, suspicion, or outright ridicule. HGB dragged her from the shadows and placed her directly in the spotlight on the cover of a national magazine and declared that her life, her desires, and her ambitions mattered. She gave millions of women explicit permission to be ambitious, to be financially independent, and to be sexual beings on their own terms. In a single stroke with Sex and the Single Girl, she helped to decouple female sexuality from the absolute necessity of marriage, a cultural shift whose profound shockwaves are still felt today. She told women that their desires for a challenging career, for their own money, for fulfilling love, for a great and guilt-free sex life were not selfish or shameful, but valid, achievable, and essential components of a full life. For countless women who felt trapped and suffocated by the rigid expectations of the 1950s, her message was not just advice. It was a lifeline, a promise of a more exciting and self-determined future. But to dismiss her as a simple anti-feminist or a shill for the patriarchy is to fundamentally misunderstand the profound nature of her rebellion. She emerged from a world where women were told, implicitly and explicitly, that they should want nothing for themselves, that their purpose was to serve others, a husband, children, a boss. Helen's most radical act was to insist that women should want everything. Her ultimate message wasn't about sex, it was about ambition. It was about the power of self-invention, the belief that you could transform yourself through sheer force of will. Her own life was the ultimate, irrefutable proof of her philosophy. She was the mouseburger who, through decades of grit, ferocious determination, and a canny, almost psychic understanding of human desire, transformed herself into a queen. She lived a long and extraordinary life, remaining a vital, energetic presence in New York City, well into her old age. She and David remained an inseparable team, their half-century-long partnership a model of mutual adoration and intellectual collaboration. David Brown passed away in 2010 at the age of 93, and his loss was a devastating blow from which Helen, then in her late 80s, never fully recovered. The great anchor of her life was gone. She herself passed away 2 years later, in August 2012, at the age of 90. True to form, she had left a final surprising headline. In her will, this famously frugal woman who brown-bagged her lunch and flew coach left a staggering $30 million endowment to be split between the journalism schools at Columbia and Stanford universities, a final grand gesture to support the next generation of storytellers and communicators. In the end, Helen Gurley Brown was not the woman Truman Capote couldn't understand. She was the woman he and his hermetically sealed world of Swans refused to see. They looked at her and saw something common, something vulgar, because she represented a force they could neither control nor comprehend, the raw, unapologetic, and life-altering ambition of the outsider. While his swans were defined by their pedigree, by the effortless grace of their birth, Helen was defined by her lack of one. Her power and her danger to their world came not from who she was, but from everything she had overcome. Her story is a quintessentially American one, a tale of audacious, relentless self-invention. But it is also a deeply human and psychological story about the enduring, motivating power of insecurity. The terrified, plain, and poor mouseburger from Arkansas was always there, just beneath the surface of the glamorous, world-famous editor-in-chief in her Chanel suit. It was that deep-seated insecurity, that feeling of being not enough, that fueled her ferocious, lifelong drive. It was the wound that never healed, but it was also the source of her superpower, a unique and powerful connection to millions of other women who also in their quietest moments felt like they were not enough. Was she a perfect feminist? Not by a long shot. Her philosophy was flawed, contradictory, consumerist, and at times deeply problematic. But she was a catalyst. She started a conversation that was messy, loud, commercial, and long overdue. She kicked down a door that had been locked and barred to women for centuries. And even if the room she led them into wasn't the perfect utopian chamber of feminist dreams, it was a room with more light, more air, and infinitely more possibilities than the one they had been confined to before.